Hello, everyone. My name is Julia, and I'm a self-taught accessibility and front-end developer living in Vienna. In today's presentation, I want to talk to you about common myths and misconceptions about accessibility. First, I'll give a brief introduction of what accessibility is and why you should care about when creating a project. Then I will go over some of the most misleading concepts about accessibility and provide answers as how they are misleading and simply not true. By the end of my presentation, I hope you'll get a sense of how important accessibility is and how you can take my arguments as good reasons to convince your team and boss to include accessibility in the next web development process from the very beginning. Let's start with a short introduction of what accessibility actually is. Web accessibility refers to a website, an app, a document, or other type of electronic communication. It means that all users, regardless of disability, have equal access to information. The internet nowadays is an important part of our daily lives, whether for work, for leisure, or even socializing. It is the ultimate source for most people to search for information. Therefore, it is more important than ever that all people have equal access to the content provided. Unfortunately, certain disabilities such as blindness or motor control can prevent people from easily accessing online content. That's why it's important to design your website for assistive technology, such as a screen reader. We are becoming more and more dependent on online interaction, so all people with different abilities should have the right to interact without barriers. So why should you care? Primarily, it's just the right thing to do. Web accessibility is designed to ensure digital accessibility for people with disabilities. But other people can also benefit from the tools and techniques of accessible design. Creating an accessible website can benefit people who are situationally limited, such as people who work or browse in a noisy environment, as we heard before, so they can't hear the sound properly, or people who can't see the screen properly because of lighting conditions. This can happen to any of us anytime. Now I would like to share a few examples of accessibility myths that I hear over and over again that should be an explanation why not to implement accessibility into a project. People are saying things like accessibility is too hard or too expensive to implement, that they are selling products that a person with some kind of disability wouldn't buy anyway, or that people who are blind do not use computers. They are saying that that accessibility is something a developer needs to handle, or that it's optional for this kind of people who don't need to do it and they don't want to sacrifice their lovely design. They're also thinking that implementing accessibility later in the project or when they score 100% with the Lighthouse, that this is enough. Or they are thinking that I have tested it last year and it was okay, so we don't need to test it again. Let's now take a closer look at some of these myths and clear them up. I have grouped them into 5 parts, but some of them could easily stand on their own. The first myth I'm going to talk about is accessibility benefits only a small minority. I think this is one of the most underrated myths of all. Maybe it's because many disabilities are invisible. It's not always obvious that someone has a disability. For example, how would you know that someone is deaf or has a poor eyesight just by seeing a person sitting on a park bench? The truth is, accessibility benefits a wide range of people. Worldwide, 1 billion people have some sort of disability. Sure, it doesn't necessarily affect a person's ability to use the internet, but without accessibility, the lives of people with disabilities could be negatively impacted in dramatic ways because they can't use the website or buy the product you are trying to sell. Most people believe that a visual impairment is the main disability affected by an inaccessible website. The fact is that mobility problems or cognitive problems affect a higher percentage of the population than visual impairment. This means that website accessibility is essential for people who cannot move their hands or arms or need switching devices, as well as for people who may have dyslexia, who need the ability to switch to a more legible font to easily read their online information. Some people believe that these people don't use the internet at all because of the disability. In reality, it's often the other way around. People with, let's say, the visual impairment often do not use a particular website because it's simply not accessible to them. Especially for people who are blind, who just a few years ago had to rely on other people to get information from a newspaper. The invention of the computer and the internet has changed their lives dramatically. This reminds me of how the social model defines disability. The social model is one of the models used to characterize disability. The definition says that disability is an avoidable condition caused by poor design. What does this mean? For example, think of an entrance to a building where there are only stairs. Is the wheelchair the problem, that the person who depends on it cannot enter the building? Or is it the poor design of the building itself that has even begun to exclude people in wheelchairs by providing only stairs? Think about it. If the building has been built at ground level, there would be no problem. The problem was created by the humans themselves when they designed something that would suddenly exclude a certain kind of people. Accessibility also impacts elderly users, such as those who experience vision loss and need higher contrast or a larger font, those who have difficulty hearing, or those who struggle with motor function. We live in a society where there are more elderly people than ever before, and the trend is upwards. And aside of the fact that we are all hopefully getting older, we can get a disability at any time. Wouldn't it be a huge impact on your life if you use a certain app every day for years and then suddenly couldn't use it anymore because you had an accident and the app wasn't designed so that the person with that kind of disability you now have could also use it? The next myth I'm going to talk about is automated testing is enough. I often see developers talking about how they have reached 100% with the automatic accessibility extension called Lighthouse, and therefore believe that the website is now fully accessible. And I must admit, just a year ago, I was one of them. I hate to break it to you, but the truth is that automated tests will only give you an idea of the things you might be doing wrong. A good result is no guarantee that the website will be accessible. Even the best automated tests can only uncover about 30% of accessibility issues. These techniques do their best, but these technologies do their best, but they will miss accessibility violations and give false positives. When thinking of a missing alt attribute, an alt tag provides alternative text for images users with visual impairment can listen to via a screen reader. Yes, the tool can detect that the alt tag is missing, but it could not create one of its own, as AI is not mature enough to interpret images. It would be super cool, but we're not there yet. Automated testing tools are a good start, but the best value is in combination with human testing. After all, your website is used by people, so real people do the best job of thoroughly testing and fixing accessibility issues. You have to do cross-browser testing and different combinations of browsers and screen readers because each screen reader behaves differently depending on the browser. And keep in mind that even if all components and widgets pass accessibility testing on their own, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are fully accessible when combined on a web page. Therefore, additional testing must be provided when a page is created. In addition, you must ensure logical reading order, heading hierarchy for sections and content, and comprehensibility, all things an automated testing tool is not fully capable of now. As we've seen in the previous myth, some believe that running an automated testing tool at the end of the project is all it needs to be done regarding accessibility. But instead, accessibility should be a part of the whole development process, from beginning to end, from planning and designing to coding and testing, until your project is ready to be released to the world. Let me give you a quick overview of how a web development process should look like. When designing a product, accessibility must be considered from the very beginning. So when doing a research, make sure that people with disabilities will also use a product. When it comes to setting requirements, define not only marketing and sales goals, but also accessibility goals, such as accessibility standards and best practices. Most of the implementation of accessibility into the process can be done in the design of the information architecture and user experience. Be aware of what to think about when designing a product with accessibility in mind. When there are clear instructions from the planning phase, it's much easier for web developers to create these components and make them accessible. They no longer have to think about how to design the component, what color or font to use, and can start coding right away. When it comes to testing, it is important that the QA tester knows how to test for accessibility and when the requirements are met. Every time you remove, add, or modify on your website, you should be making accessibility a part of this by asking yourself, the feature I removed, does this now destroy the heading order for screen reader users? Or the new thing I added, can it be used with only a keyboard? Because this leads to another misconception quite well. If your website was already fully accessible, that doesn't mean it remains accessible forever. Websites are constantly being updated, having new content added. And unless these changes are tested in some way, there's no guarantee that they remain as such. Also, technology changes over time. Web browsers get new features, screen readers change the way the content is displayed. Sometimes these changes affect how people perceive a website. For example, recent changes to many operating systems that introduce dark and high contrast mode have changed the way many websites look to some people. We can't rely on results of a test to hold true over time. But if it's part of our process, then we can say with confidence that our product is consistently accessible. As a team, you must permanently integrate accessibility into the web development process. And this seems far away from a short-term thing for me. If you only introduce accessibility as a final step, it can be very difficult to implement, often leading to poor design or even not implementing it at all. It could also make the process longer and more expensive, which we will talk about in the next misconception. Companies are often concerned about how much extra time and cost accessibility takes. And after talking about the entire development process in the previous myth, I understand why it seems like accessibility is difficult and expensive. But it all comes down to how accessibility is handled in the process. If accessibility is implemented properly from the beginning, as previously mentioned, the overall development process increases by 5% at most, which I think is perfectly acceptable. While if accessibility is added at the end of the development process or much later, the time and cost could double or triple. I mean, adding accessibility when the project is already completed, good luck. Also, see accessibility as a cost with its benefits. A very important point that many people don't think about is that people with disabilities can spend money too. Financially, you want your product and services to be accessible to all in order to be purchased by as many people as possible. According to the Purple Bond, businesses are losing out of a potential of £2 billion because the website is not accessible for people with disabilities, which prevents these people of purchasing the product sold on the website. And that figure doesn't even take into consideration those people who have a temporary disability, like a broken wrist. If people with disabilities can access your website, and if they like what you offer, of course, they are likely to buy it. But if they can't access your website, it doesn't matter much if they like what you offer because they can't go through the buying process. So accessibility benefits your bottom line. Protecting human rights of people with disabilities by providing equal access to information makes good business sense. Socially, you have the choice between positioning yourself as a company that does not meet accessibility expectation or supporting equal opportunity through digital accessibility. It also allows you to stand out from your competitors. Technically, the code and information are cleaner when websites are developed with accessibility in mind. Fully accessible websites are easier for search engines to index and catalog too, making the website easier for everyone to find. Your website will automatically be compatible with a wide range of devices, because accessible designs requires you to qualitatively test the robustness of your website on many platforms, browsers, and devices with variety of input methods. Accessibility is also a legal issue. Creating accessible websites helps protect against potential legal problems and is sometimes mandatory when it comes to the public section. In the United States, the Americans with Disability Act says that website accessibility lawsuits have increased since 2018, particularly in New York, Florida, and California, as you can see in the graph. The law may be different depending on the country in which the company is located, but also these laws can change in the future and address other sections as well. In addition, people with disabilities have rights and could sue your company if the website is not accessible. This means bad press and huge costs that are completely avoidable if you create an accessible website from the very beginning. In my opinion, developing accessibility from the beginning is reasonable compared to the cost of the alternatives, such as implementing accessibility as a last step, negative publicity, or lawsuits. The last myth I'm going to talk about is accessibility is ugly. This myth is my all-time favorite because it's so not true in any way. An accessible design does not mean the design is ugly. It means, accessible websites can be ugly, and there are a lot of ugly accessible websites out there, but it's not accessibility that makes them ugly. And there are a lot of ugly inaccessible websites too. If the UI is ugly, you may want to look for another designer. And in the end, whether something is ugly depends on the eye of the beholder anyway. Most designers don't know about accessibility or have misconceptions about it, like thinking it will limit their creativity. I hear this so often from designers. If I make my website accessible, they will look ugly and they won't be appealing to people who don't need accessibility. No, many websites and apps are ugly, but that's because they're poorly designed. Accessibility has absolutely nothing to do with how appealing a website or app is. But accessibility breaks my design. No, accessibility doesn't break the design. It just means that you have to make a few adjustments. For example, you may not be able to use the font size or color of your first choice. But there are many examples of beautifully designed accessible websites. While it's true that things like good color contrast and larger font size affect the design, that doesn't necessarily mean it's ugly. If a design relies on low contrast or very small functional elements, the design itself is more likely to be poor and cause problems for everyone, regardless of ability. But when designing for accessibility, I have to design with dark color. No. One aspect of accessibility is to ensure sufficient color contrast between foreground and background colors for text and many other important elements, but that doesn't mean you have to use dark colors. If you were to use only dark colors, you would not be able to combine them. You can use a lighter color against a darker one and vice versa, as long as you check that the contrast requirements for the essential elements are met. Sometimes just adjusting the color a little bit, lightening or darkening one of the elements, is enough to make them work. But accessibility is boring. No, accessibility doesn't mean you have to design a boring layout. Just because content like videos and complex graphics and interactive elements necessarily require accessibility consideration, some people believe that an accessible web presence means sacrificing fun, engaging content in favor of text-only design. If you've been told this, you should know that it's not true. There's nothing stopping you from being creative. Most people don't even notice good design or accessibility but they definitely will notice poor design and functionality. Since I started programming, I perceive websites and applications very differently. I very often look at the code to see if a button is a real button and a link is a real link. And I notice immediately if the color contrast is not high enough and wonder how hard can it be to make the color just a tiny bit darker so that the contrast is high enough for everyone. Most accessibility features are invisible anyway and usually only accessible to screen readers. And please keep in mind that accessible design doesn't just make life easier for people with disabilities. In many cases, it makes things possible, meaning that accessibility is not just a nice to have, it's necessary. Let's recap and summarize all the points that can be used as arguments for accessibility and which dispel all the myths mentioned above. Taking accessibility into account already in the design process makes it a lot easier and results in a better design than retrofitting as a last step. It won't take much more time and cost if you make it part of our process compared to consequences like doing it at the end or getting an expensive fine. Web accessibility is smart business. It prevents you from future lawsuits and helps you get more potential customers. Accessibility improves public perception through an accessible website or web application because it shows that you and your company care. This can also serve as a leverage against your competitors who are not committed to these values. And in the end, accessibility benefits everyone. Accessible design doesn't just make life easier for people with disabilities, as already said. It makes things possible. With accessible design, people with poor motor skills or limited to no vision can perceive information completely on their own without having to rely on the help of others. Let me end my presentation by sharing a personal experience. My parents-in-law are both deaf. Unimaginably, many years ago, they relied on newspapers or other people to perceive news since news on the television didn't have closed caption yet. And when we watch a movie together, it's always fascinating to read the closed caption and audio description, things I perceive very differently. It shows me every time how important these are so that we all perceive the same information what is shown, even if it is with different senses. Accessibility will never disappear. As long as there are people on this planet, there will always be a need for accessible design. Use these reasons as good arguments to convince your team and boss to design the next website in an accessible way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia, for your presentation, and thanks for sharing your personal experience regarding this subject. So now we are having questions, time for questions. We already have one in the queue, so I'm going to just look at our chat. Okay, first one. Why do you think accessibility is so underrated? It sounds like something that should be taken seriously.
Yeah, I mean, because of all the myths I was talking about in the presentation, people have just misconceptions about it and don't, I think maybe it's because some people are surrounded by people with disabilities, so they don't know the effect on these people. So this could also be a huge problem. Since I am surrounded with people who rely on things like this, it's important for me. And yeah, I hope I can spread the word to the world and make it important for other people too.
Yes, that totally makes sense. I also have someone with disability in my family, and simple things like just being able to wash their hands is difficult for them because everything is made for people higher and not smaller. So yeah, it's something that we need to take care of that. another question from Tiffany. So what are some steps we can take to actively include accessibility in mind as we are building a project?
I think, especially in the planning and or especially in the designing phase, it's important to already choose fonts and colors which are accessible. These things should be decided already in the planning phase, so that a developer don't have to handle it anymore.
And by the way, do you have any tools that you use in your daily basis that you can share with us?
I mostly use the tools Josephine already mentioned in her talk. Yeah, the XTab tools and Tably, Wave, these kind of tools. And of course, the tab key is very important to go through the website only with your key. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. Anyone else has any more questions? Let me just check. Okay, I have one from myself, but I think you already answered that. What solutions can we come up with to raise awareness of people to start paying more attention to accessibility? Do you think, for example, in a context of building a product, having someone with a real disability working together in a team maybe helps?
This would definitely help. I'm not sure if companies are aware of to employ people with disabilities. This would also be a great impact.
Yeah, I was thinking because we have a tester in our company and he has some color blindness. So it doesn't see the same colors as we. It's something so simple, but we need to take care of that. And sometimes we are so focused on just building the new feature that we are not aware of that's just a small tweak that we can do and improve someone else's life regarding this.
Yep.
Okay. Questions? Any more questions? I see so many people in the crowd. And okay, another question. Thank you so much. Do you think that accessibility should be advocated?
Yes, totally.
Almost as we have developer advocates for a product, to also have developer advocates for accessibility, for example.
Yep. So, I think it's coming. There are more and more people who also deferrals or advocates who are for accessibility.
You also already do some part of that job, right? By sharing things on your Twitter, I see content related with that. That is very
I'm trying to blog post on DevTO and Hashnode and writing as much as I can about accessibility.
That's really cool. I'm going to look for your Hashnode in order to share here with the audience.